Well, that was fast. The United States has captured Nicolas Maduro, the now former president of Venezuela, in a daring overnight raid. It has been very much a blink and you might miss it affair. Those of us in the United States went to sleep not knowing anything was happening and woke up to find out that Venezuela no longer has a leader. Literally, the headline at 2 a.m. Eastern Time was, "Venezuela accuses U.S. of carrying out military aggression. Maduro activates defense plans." By 4:21 a.m., it was Trump on Truth Social saying that the United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with U.S. law enforcement, details to follow, which presumably will be at today's press conference. This happens in the wake of the United States slowly amassing a large naval presence along the Caribbean, which was not enough to launch an invasion of the country. And to be clear, that is not what happened overnight. It was just a surgical strike and extraction operation. More of a special military operation, if you will, except this one barely lasted 3 hours, never mind 3 days, and certainly not more than 3 years. Indeed, the U.S. naval presence was better geared to do things like strike alleged cartel speedboats, and then later engage in a campaign to capture oil tankers key to keeping Venezuela's economy afloat, with the capture of the Skipper tanker seen here. You would be forgiven if you thought that the latter campaign would have lasted longer, because there is a non-trivial chance that economically strangling Maduro would have worked. But then again, maybe it did. Let me explain what I mean. And as a preface here, we do not have any real information about what went on, other than that there was a small amount of shock and awe over Caracas, which culminated in Maduro's capture. There are 2 different ways this could have gone about. One is that the United States had just figured everything out. The folks over at Intelligence knew exactly what Maduro's movements looked like. They knew how to disable key air defenses to allow for helicopters to operate with impunity over the capital, and they knew exactly when to capture Maduro. This was a target of opportunity, and the U.S. execution of it was flawless. Well, at least pending any reports of U.S. casualties. That is always a possibility, but given the limited nature of the operation, there cannot be all that many if there are any at all. An alternative question, and certainly the more intriguing one, is whether the Venezuelan military put much effort into stopping the United States. At this point, the Venezuelan military has not implicated itself in a manner that would make it impossible to come back from. Whether there was an explicit or implicit agreement set up, you could think of it like this. The Venezuelan military holds coercive power domestically because they are the ones with the guns, regardless of whether Maduro is in power. Even without a backroom deal being made with the Trump administration, the military could have reasoned in the following way. There was almost no chance that Venezuela would be able to stop the United States if the United States was truly committed to removing Maduro. The economic calamity caused by a de facto U.S. blockade on the Venezuelan oil industry was about to make everyone associated with the regime very unpopular. Thus, sticking with Maduro was a long-term losing proposition. But if the military retains all of its guns, it can just sit there in the country and then permit a true democratic election. The winner will be inclined to stick with the military status quo, at least to some degree. After all, this hypothetical new leader was elected under that status quo, so trying to change it may be politically unwise. And the military, again, has the guns, so it may also be practically unwise. This is a bigger point about international relations that is often overlooked in the media. The prospect of things that will happen is what drives affairs in the present. You do not need to actually observe a bad outcome for the shadow of that bad outcome to have an effect. Anyway, once more, we do not know whether the United States explicitly made such an offer or not. But at least as of now, we are tacitly in that situation. The Venezuelan military has not committed wide-scale atrocities yet. So by the Trump administration's thinking, if you just allow for the transition of power, we have no reason to take further action against you. Everyone in the military leadership can keep their jobs. You will appear heroic to the Venezuelan people. Alternatively, you can fight. You will lose. Maduro is already gone, and you are not about to invade the United States to get him back. And if you try anything like this, you can bet that you will no longer be welcome once the new government enters office. A couple of weeks ago, I had written out a script for a video on the US strategy in Venezuela, which is now a bit outdated. But here is what I had to say about this possibility. The tricky part here is that the military would still have to successfully initiate a coup. Well, the United States just removed the tricky part. There is no coordination problem to solve, in which the military only wants to act if it expects everyone to follow suit. It would be like if during the Prigozhin affair from a couple of years ago, Ukraine magically removed Putin from power as the convoy traveled to Moscow. The hard part is over. The status quo has turned to not supporting Maduro, and it is much easier to get everyone to follow the status quo than it is to change minds. Now, even with Maduro gone, parts of his government remain. Venezuela has a vice president who, at least at one time, was not completely untouchable by the US government. In theory, she should now take over as president, unless, the Venezuelan military steps in to stop that. So maybe the status quo is not quite as clear as I just described. Then again, that also assumes that she wants to remain in power, which might be a risky strategy given that the United States so easily reached the last person in power, who was presumably better ready for such a capture operation. You can bet that the United States is already putting out some feelers with a gentle suggestion that she perhaps consider overseeing a transition. If that is the way this goes, then in short order, we will see a temporary government of Venezuela established, likely looking toward its very long-run opposition for leadership, because it seems that the war was over before most people knew that it started, and well before anyone in Maduro's counter-coalition could lift a finger to militarily help him. Undoubtedly, the operation is going to give everyone in Moscow and Beijing a very long day. China worked with Venezuela's oil industry, and now that connection seems to have ended overnight. Even Russia had an oil connection there. Despite both being oil exporters, Venezuela needed assistance with its production. It was one of the few places that Russia could look for foreign financial support, and it is also gone. Politically in the United States, it will be interesting to see how this plays out. We have discussed before the Trump administration's incentive to fight in Venezuela as a distraction from what is going on with domestic politics. Ironically, if that was his goal, the operation did not go very well precisely because, militarily speaking, it went very well. But it does tell us that Marco Rubio has a lot of sway internally. He was the one long advocating for action in Venezuela, and we now know Trump was not just placing assets in the Caribbean for show. Meanwhile, if you think that this is the end of the video, then congratulations! You just committed the same fallacy that the Bush administration made way back in 2003. Here is another thing that I wrote from that abandoned script of 2 weeks ago. If there is one thing I am not worried about, it is the United States accomplishing its military mission in Venezuela. That is the easy part. If the Trump administration wants to put in the effort to do it, it will not be a problem. Well, so far so good on that belief. However, if there is one thing that does worry me, it is what happens to the country afterward. And it was especially concerning back in November, when the media began seriously reporting on a possible invasion, and leaks from inside of the White House suggested that there was little to no thought about the proverbial day after. The charitable interpretation of the delay in real action is that the administration has been working on a plan so that they do not have to do it live. And there is reporting that plans were being made, even if it is unclear whether the lack of planning is what caused the delay. One central lesson from Iraq is that the United States, under no circumstances, ought to pursue a policy analogous to de-Baathification, which is what followed the fall of Saddam Hussein. De-Baathification, with its hyphen and apostrophe, is not only atrociously spelled, it was also atrociously designed. Basically, it said that anyone connected to Saddam Hussein's political party was henceforth fired and would not be welcomed back. One slight problem. anyone working for the government had to join the party as a prerequisite for the job, even if they had no political bones in their bodies. Thus, de-Baathification meant that no one in Iraq's new civil service had any idea what they were doing. Chaos ensued. To make matters worse, a bunch of those individuals had guns. And if there is one thing you have learned from this channel, it is that agreements must be made commensurate with the balance of power to be sustainable. Telling a bunch of people with guns that they are no longer welcome is not commensurate with the balance, as it turns out. Aside from that, in comparison to Iraq, Venezuela has 2 upsides and 1 downside. Upside number 1 is that there is not the same type of ethnic fractionalization in Venezuela as there was in Iraq, with a minority group ruling over a majority group, and the latter poised to dominate democratic elections. Upside number 2 is that the structure of government is more or less already in place in Venezuela, and it will not require the same level of domestic upheaval to implement democratic institutions. Autocrats running democratic elections is often the target of jokes, and rightfully so. But at least in Venezuela's case, the people there are used to real elections, even if they are not accustomed to having the true vote counts dictate the winner. So, the plan would be to replace Maduro with someone from the opposition, and then run another election shortly thereafter, so that there are no questions about the legitimacy of whoever wins. That takes us to the one downside. Venezuela has cartels. Remember how that was supposed to be the whole reason that this thing got started? In any case, the cartels are well-organized de facto militant groups already. That puts them a step ahead of where all of the various factions in Iraq were during the initial invasion. And the problem for me is that the politics and territorial control of those groups is opaque. Consequently, I'm going to leave that discussion here. One hopes someone in Washington had worked out the real details before executing the extraction mission. Either way, the die is cast. Whether this turns into a long-run civil war will depend on the actions taken in the next hours, to days, to weeks, to months. Bush's poor management of Iraq sunk his historical legacy. Trump has shown no willingness to stick with long-term military operations. Unless something about Venezuela makes the country different, then being absolutely perfect during the transition period will be critical for this to go well over the long run. If you want to learn more about the US-Venezuela crisis, check out this new playlist that I made on the subject. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.